Hi, and welcome to our first class. This is going to be a video that's going to help describe the first concepts that we want to cover in our leadership program, which is first about understanding what transformational leadership means, and then looking at some models that can help us predict the behavior of some of the folks that we will be working with as we go through our change. In this case, for our class, it'll be your change project. Let's start out by focusing on our own leadership. Part of my role as a leader of my team is to ensure stability. It's my job to make sure our processes are lean and predictable, that they're efficient for our group. It's important for me to make sure that there's enough stability so that folks stay engaged in my team. And it's also my role to understand and identify some of the next steps that we have when we're talking about our action planning, and that also promotes stability. But part of my role is also to encourage instability. And by that I mean making sure that the folks who are focusing in on the next steps and understanding what our stakeholders require, understanding what our external environment is looking at and changing to, and making sure we're responsive to our particular stakeholder base is all part of change or promoting instability. Every time you introduce change, you're introducing instability to the group. So I'm constantly balancing between the two. I'm ensuring stability, at the same time I'm promoting instability. And that dichotomy is really the foundation of what we see with transformational leaders. When we think of transformational leaders, we're really identifying a series of skills that help people be effective in leading and implementing change. What you see identified, and when you look at it, you initially see a series of skills: being visionary, empowering, community builder, administrative, analytical. But in fact, this diagram is telling us something different. These are really contrary skills. In other words, being visionary and analytical are two different opposite ends of the spectrum. So for each change that I'm thinking about, I'm looking at the blend of these particular elements on the spectrum. Does this skill, are the skills that I need for this change project need to be more visionary or analytical? Do I need to be more empowering or energetic? And when we say energetic, what we really mean is more managerial, more making sure that things are getting accomplished as they should. Should I be a community builder, or should I be performing on my own, providing independent analysis and independent action? Should I be creative, thinking about next steps, or should I be more administrative, getting the task done? When you're looking at this particular model of transformational leadership, I want you to think about, first of all, what your own environment requires along the spectrums, because they're contrary skills. And then second of all, be thinking about what specifically is required for you for this change project. The next thing we're going to think about is, how do people react to change? And we're going to look at a couple of different models to give us insights about traditional reactions to change. The first is looking at and understanding an innovation model, which helps us understand, are people creating the change? In other words, are they innovators? Are they early adopters? In other words, they operate very well in ambiguity and they embrace change. They can't wait to do something new. Or are they more late adopters? They're more conservative, a little more cautious. They tend to be concerned about all the implications of a change. Now, how does this help us? Well, when I'm thinking about a change, I'm trying to understand how people in my team are going to react to the change. I'm going to identify those folks who just love tinkering. Those are the innovators. And those are the ones who often bring a lot of energy and excitement to it. Similarly with my early adopters, they're the ones who are going to want to try it out first. And so that gives me some good insights. Finally, by the time we have our plan in place and things are cranking along, I'll bring in the late adopters. Now, do I always bring people in according to the focus that they have around each of these different buckets? No. Sometimes I want to help build the strength of the others. So if someone is an early adopter, I want them to understand how we need to be planful sometimes, slow them down. Sometimes I want the late adopters to come in and play more of a role in the innovation phase. So we can certainly help people develop skills around each of these areas, but the key is it helps me predict how people are going to respond to the change and then plan for it. What kind of resources are we going to need? How are we going to need to support these folks? One model that's best known for helping understand how people tend to react to change is the Bridges model. Bridges model helps us identify some specific phases of resistance. So the first phase is denial. We have heard a change is coming. We can't possibly imagine that this is what will happen. We can't possibly think that this is going to really be the way things are going to be. And so we're in denial. We're really pushing back on understanding not only that the change is going to happen, but also ignoring the consequences. In fact, some people will talk about it as the program du jour. In other words, this happens all the time. They always introduce these ideas and then they never actually take place. That's really ignoring consequences or minimizing the particular impact. They're going to change this a little bit, but it really won't have a big impact on me. That's really phase one, the denial phase. Phase two is full-blown resistance. And if you've gone through a change, you've either experienced it yourself or you've seen it in other people. This is a bad idea. We should not be doing this change. That's really an indication of resistance. People are stressed, they're anxious, they are not comfortable with the change that's taking place. Now, between resistance and exploration, phase three is kind of almost a hidden phase, because what can happen is as people start to venture out of resistance and into exploration, they'll tend to stop. There's a lot of opportunities for them to move right back into resistance. And so in a way, this in-between part is where we want to support people the most. There are going to be a lot of triggers. Maybe the change is hard to implement, or it's uncomfortable, or we're learning new skills. And so it's going to be very easy to move back into resistance. Be aware as people are starting to move into exploration, trying things out, seeing what's going to happen. What does this change mean for me? How do I build these skills? We have to be aware that there's always that risk that they'll move back into resistance. So plan accordingly in your project. Help build in reinforcers, people who can help be more encouraging, maybe cheerleaders. Are there resources people need at that point? Is there some encouragement that people need? Is there a new skill that they need? What do they need to keep themselves moving forward into exploration and ultimately into commitment and not back into resistance? Phase four is what we call the new normal, right? You're in commitment. You love the change. Everything feels really comfortable and you're so glad that it happened. Similarly, we do find people can move from commitment back into resistance, so through exploration. But most of the time, we want to keep the momentum going. And people who are in commitment are great at now pulling other folks who are in exploration into the commitment phase. We can use the Bridges model as a foundation for helping us plan what activities that we need to provide throughout the change. How do we plan for resources? How do we plan for support for folks based on their reactions to the change? What you see now in this slide is an example of how that would work. So you notice across the top, you see the Bridges phases: denial, resistance, exploration, and commitment. And on the left-hand column, what you're seeing is some of the stages of a change process. So when I'm learning about a change, the first thing is general awareness. The next stage is engagement, detailed knowledge of the change. Then I need to talk about the training and the skills associated with it and make sure we have the reinforcement for the change. There might be other examples of these stages that you could incorporate in based on the change itself. The way I use this tool is to now think about, if we're in the awareness of change, what kinds of things should I be doing for the people who are in denial? What kinds of things will the people who are in resistance need? How can I turn them around? If you're in exploration as you become aware of the change, and that's probably not too many people, maybe some of the planners, what kinds of resources would they need? And then finally, if you are already committed to the change, perhaps you were part of the planning group again, as you become aware of this change, what kinds of resources will they need? What kinds of things could they do? So for any stages, what we're doing is breaking down by Bridges' model for the folks who are in that phase what they need specifically. It also can be used as a communication tool. So if we're in the awareness of change, how will I use introducing the change in a communication vehicle for folks who are in the denial phase, or who are in the resistance phase, or who are in the exploration phase, etc. So this is a great tool for you to think about using in your own project as you start to plan out your change. List your action steps on the left-hand side, and across the top put the bridges phases, and start to think about what do folks need for each one of these phases. GE provided us a nice model that helps us start to think about why we often encounter resistance when folks are introduced to a change. What they called it was the 4 Ps, and they said that what we need to do is be able to answer the questions around the 4 Ps. That will help minimize some of the resistance we might encounter as we introduce change itself. So first, the purpose. Why are we changing? What's the underlying reason why we need to make this change happen? And why are we doing this right now? The big picture. What is it going to look like when the change is successfully implemented? Help me with the vision. Tell me what the future is going to look like. What's our future state? And you'll see why I use that term in a minute. What's our plan? Walk me through. What are the steps that we need to be doing? How do you anticipate rolling out this change? What's the time frame associated with it? And then the part to play. All that was interesting, but really what I care about is how does it impact me? So help explain to me what my part is in the change process. Help me understand how I can play a role in providing feedback about the change, how I can gain commitment around the change based on the way that you're introducing it. This is one of my favorite tools because it helps remind us at a very high level what are all the components we need for successful change. We need vision. We need to make sure that people have the right skills in place to accomplish the change. We need to provide incentives. And normally when I say the word incentives, people think about money or some kind of financial reward. But here what we're really saying is how do we reinforce the change? And there are a lot of different ways we can use reinforcement. Resources. What kinds of things do I need to do in order to reinforce the change? What kinds of things will I need to do to make sure the change is successful? What does that look like in terms of the resources required? The action plan, the detailed steps associated with it. What's wonderful about this chart is we now know the 5 high-level steps that we need to make sure the change is rolled out effectively. But sometimes folks will come to me and say, you know, I'm getting a sense of a lot of anxiety about the change, and I'm not sure what's missing. And this chart helps us understand if it's anxiety, do you think maybe folks don't know what skills are going to be required? And more specifically, how do they acquire those skills? If it's about confusion, did we do a good job with the vision? Should we go back and help explain what our big picture is looking like? Full starts, so it feels like stuff is starting up and then it stops again. Did we do a good job with our action plan? Should we go back and look at what are the things that we put down on the action plan and maybe revise it? So this is a wonderful tool not only for reminding us of the 5 components of a successful change, but it also helps us figure out when change is going awry, what might be the underlying cause. In 2009, my company Partners for Results Worldwide completed a study to better understand what are some of the key success factors that are needed in change. We're going to share with you some of the research conclusions now, but I'll ask you to keep them confidential and not to publish them or distribute them further than the class. So what we learned is there are really 3 key components. And by the way, I mentioned that this was from 2009, and we have revisited this study since that point and found the same conclusions hold all these years later. So the first thing that we needed to make sure we have in order for change to be successful in a large organization is active and visible executive sponsorship. In other words, the top leaders of the organization need to be bought into this, and they need to be actively discussing and supporting the change itself. We'll see what that means in a few more slides, but the concept is that we need to make sure that we have the folks at the top really reinforcing the change. Often we think we've communicated the reason for the change. We've talked about this in a number of ways earlier in our presentation. However, it's interesting when you go and talk to the folks in the field how little they seem to understand what the change is. It's true for most interventions and projects that we do. We think we've been great at communicating all the information, but the folks we're communicating to really don't have it. So what that means is we need to make sure we're frequent with our communication about the change. Why are we doing this? Go back to those 4 Ps we just discussed. And we also need to make sure that communication is open. And by that, we mean that there's a process for feedback. As we get information back from folks that they're saying, this is what we need to do to tweak or tailor our approach. This is what's working, this is what's not working. And in order to make that effective, we need to be open to it. And finally, we need to use a structured change management process. And we'll be talking about that throughout our program of what that looks like. And specifically next week, when we start to have an understanding of what are the components of change management. So why doesn't change work out the way we had hoped it would? One of the reasons that we see change management not come through the way we had hoped or not meet our expectation has to really do with that sponsorship that we talked about earlier. Often, it's not only that the leaders themselves were not visible and openly supportive of the change, but also we ask for the sponsorship from the wrong folks. Maybe they don't have the influence level that we need in order to be gaining commitment from the rest of the organization. Resistance we're going to talk about more throughout our program, but that tends to sometimes be the one thing that quietly undermines the change we had in mind. And we're going to talk more about how do we deal with resistance? What kind of steps do we take? Insufficient funding and resources. I was working with a company recently that was introducing a new software to their organization. And the software that was running on the old computers was really slow and cumbersome. They hadn't thought about the fact that they were going to need to update their technology in order to be successful. So we need to really think through what are the resources that we're going to need to make this change successful. And the last one is middle management resistance. Middle management really has the toughest job within the organization because they're often the ones who are responsible for taking the vision, that proactive high-level vision and strategic concepts that upper management is often talking about and making it very pragmatic, making it actionable, making it able to be understood by the rest of the organization and by their teams. So they have to really walk in both worlds. They have to walk in the strategic world, but they also have to walk in the pragmatic world of everyday action. And how do we make this real for the rest of the organization? So we often try to make sure that whenever we're doing a change, we're working very closely with the middle managers and getting their insights and their concerns because we need to make sure we're supporting them. They're integral in terms of the change overall and its success. As a leader, I have a number of responsibilities when we're talking about the change process. For all levels, we need to make sure we're communicating about why the change is happening, what their role is going to be in that change, how things are going to be supported, what it looks like in terms of the team's everyday life. We need to make sure we're demonstrating support for the change, reinforcing that this is something that we're buying into. We need to provide coaching because not everyone is going to be at the same level as we discussed at the beginning of our presentation. How do we help people through these various stages? How do we get them the right resources if they need it? Help them get the right skills if that's the critical issue. We need to also make sure that we're providing support to the team who is managing the change. And sometimes that support can be by giving them feedback. It can be positive feedback, but it can also be constructive. Here's what's working and here's what's not working. And then as part of that, we need to be aware of the resistance that might be taking place. And sometimes resistance is very valid, and it means that we need to realign our approach. So understanding that resistance can help us not only move people through the resistance phase, but often help realign the kind of activities in our action plan so that it better meets the needs of the group. There are a number of different roles that we ask folks to play when we're going through a change. Here's some of the key roles that we see. We've talked already about the sponsor, the individual or the group who's going to support and legitimize the change. The change agent, that's you, if you're talking about your project. It's the person who is really responsible for designing and implementing the change project. I'm not crazy about the term target, but the concept here is who are the group that is actually going to be changing. And then the advocate. The advocate tends to be a little bit different than the sponsor. This is the person who is our cheerleader for the change. As you're starting to think about your project that you'll be completing, who's going to be providing each one of these key roles in the change? As I mentioned, you're the change agent. The sponsor plays a number of important roles throughout the change project, but I wanted to highlight just three. First, participating actively and visibly through the project. Sometimes we'll get folks who say that they're sponsoring the change, and what happens is they tend to say yes and then they disappear. So we want someone who's going to be very active and visible. Build a coalition of sponsorship, so they're working with their peers or others in the organization to make sure everyone is supporting the change. And then that communication role. How do we communicate directly with all the folks who are going to be impacted with the change in a number of different ways? Our next step is to create a blueprint for our change project. We're going to do this in a document called My Change Project Worksheet Summary, which you'll find under the Signature Assignments Action Learning Plan. Ultimately, you're going to take this Change Project Worksheet Summary and attach it to our Week 2 discussion board and discuss it within your learning circles to make sure that you're getting all the feedback you need to plan your change well. There are a couple things that we want to make sure we cover. The slide you're seeing right now is a graphic version of your plan, but of course the My Change Project worksheet has quite a few components of this, but in a Word document, so it's easier for you to just type in. So the way I start this blueprint is to start out by thinking about our future state. What is it that we see this change accomplishing? What is the vision that we have when everything has gone well and the change is completed? What's it going to look like? And now go back to the left-hand side of our blueprint and talk about where we are currently. What does the current state look like? And what that does is it helps us really start to think about what we need to do to make those change happen. So we have a current state, we have a future state. What do we need to do in between that? The first is to think about our key stakeholders. Who's going to be affected by this change? Who needs to be the sponsor? How are we going to make sure we engage folks? So think broadly about who the key stakeholders are. Then what are the action plans? Where folks tend to go wrong on this project page is usually when their action plan is very light. We want you to think about specifically, what are you going to accomplish week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. And of course, week 6 is just really a wrap-up of your project. So be detailed. Specifically, what does your change project look like? And then finally, how are we going to measure success? And I think equally importantly, how are we going to build in some milestones that help us think about what kinds of tools that we can use to make sure that, or measures we can use to make sure that the change is on progress and that we're accomplishing what we need to accomplish. So now that we have completed our class lecture, what I'd like you to do is go to the tab, Signature Assignments. Again, you're going to go into the Action Learning Project, and once again, you'll see the My Change Project Worksheet Summary. Please print that out. Start to map out your project using that tool. You'll be attaching that to the discussion board starting Monday morning to get additional feedback. If you're not sure, by the way, of what kind of project you want, what you want to do is now maybe look at the examples of previous student projects, which you'll also find in the same section, just to get some ideas. So that gives us a brief introduction on some of the key things you want to be thinking about as you start to plan your project. In our class presentation today, we've talked a little bit about what does transformational leadership look like. We've talked about how people typically respond to change, and your readings will correspond to that. We've also talked about how you start to plan your project. Again, I want to highlight how important it is for you to be very specific and detailed around the action steps you'll take for each week. So do map out, for week 2 I'll be accomplishing this, for week 3 I'll be accomplishing this. You really have a very short time to complete this project. So do start working on your project certainly by the beginning of week 2, so that you're able to at least connect in with your stakeholders, get buy-in for the change itself. Week 2, you'll also be getting feedback from your learning circle, and they'll be able to give you some insights and some feedback around the plan. I can't wait to hear about your project and look forward to working with you over the next few days to better understand what your project will be. Have a great day.